Noodle's looking forward to coming for its holiday, John.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming along tonight. We'll just let everybody slowly trickle in. I can see it starting to happen. All right. Well, without further ado, thanks for everyone being patient while we get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Rachel Oxborough, Executive Officer with Grain Producers. Tonight, we're here for a special event.
Can't hear anybody.
Tonight, we're here for a special event with some experts to talk to us about super tax and the family farm, understanding the impacts of proposed superannuation changes. So Grain Producers Australia is the national voice for Australian grain farmers. We advocate for policies and decisions that support the long-term sustainability, profitability and resilience of grain producers around the country. We've organised this webinar to provide clarity on the federal government's proposed superannuation tax changes, specifically the taxation of unrealised capital gains on balances above $3 million. This has raised some serious questions for farming families who use self-managed super funds, or SMSFs, as a part of their business and succession planning. To help unpack the issues tonight, I'm joined by Barry Large, Chair of Grain Producers Australia, Katie Timms, Partner in Business Advisory at RSM Australia, and John Thomson, Chartered Accountant with Seer Financial Group. We'll start a guided panel discussion tonight and then we'll open up for your questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A box at any point during the session and we'll aim to get through those in the second half of this evening. Tonight, the first person I'd like to call on to talk with is GPA's Chairman and WA Grain Grower, Barry Large. Barry, really interested in your point of view as a grain grower, but also as a GPA representative. What have you been hearing directly from growers about this issue?
Oh, look, thanks, Rach, and thanks for your effort in organising this. And before I go any further, it would be remiss of me not to say thanks, Katie, for making yourself available. And John, thank you very much for making yourself available. It's a pleasure to be able to tap people on the shoulder and just stand up and want to help. So firstly, I have to say that I really appreciate it, especially when we're talking about something that's very topical and is a concern to growers. I think at the end of the day, I'm still trying to digest it myself. We try to manage our farms effectively and efficiently, and we go into deal with our taxation issues and our succession planning and our long-term viability. And this was one of the tools that we're using and thinking that this is a good thing going forward. With the view of being taxed on unrealised capital gains, it certainly scares you when you could be like South Australia or Victoria, and as I am nationally representing all growers across the country, at the moment it's a very nauseating feeling to be in South Australia or Victoria trying to work out how we're going to feed the stock, let alone how we're going to pay the tax on an unrealised capital gain. So it's not palatable, and it's something that I really welcome Katie and John to try and help us tick the boxes and get across the hurdle. And hopefully the other side of the coin here is that the government of the day is listening to us and taking consideration for the effect that this has on all of us going forward. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Barry. I think that really sums up exactly why we're here tonight, and we've got some great insight coming up from John and Katie. I do want to start with you, John, before we sort of dig into the actual specifics of what the government is proposing. I'd really be interested in us getting a short history of Australia's super system, how it's kind of evolved and gotten us to this point. Oh, sorry, John, you're just muted there.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so superannuation was really only became prevalent in 1993 when the laws started to evolve where superannuation became available to working people. And prior to that, it was the domain of judges and politicians and selected people in the community. And over the period of time, super funds have been seen to be a strategy to reduce the amount and the number of transfer payments in the economy. Now, transfer payments are where someone pays tax then because they have a certain standard of living or there's a social desire, payments are made back to them. So there's this revolving process of cash being collected by the taxman, then redistributed to the political whim of the day on who they believe is most deserving. During this whole process, there has been decisions made by various politicians that have suited them on the day. And as a consequence, superannuation hasn't evolved equally, it hasn't evolved equitably. And we've got to a point where especially self-managed super funds are seen to be the domain of the wealthy, and they're the parties who are using the system to effectively pay less tax. The public, the industry funds, which are the most dominant funds in Australia, are the domains of the unions. They control them for the benefit of the workers, and they do a very good job of it. However, there's always been a gap in that environment to allow someone to set up a self-managed super fund, which has been the domain of people who want to buy property, principally, or actually want to manage their own superannuation outcome. SMS, a very small number of people in Australia. There's probably 3 to 4% of taxpayers involved in them, but they are seen in a similar light as family trusts, where if you've got an SMF or you've got a family trust, you seem to be someone who doesn't pay their fair share of tax. And the current changes are an indication of a fundamental shift in tax policy, where the comrades in Canberra who have drafted this legislation have identified self-managed super funds and lumpy assets, and lumpy assets are principally commercial property or farms, where if they test the waters on taxing those unrealised gains, can they get away with that? Can they find acceptance before they move progressively into other asset classes or other business entities? A Pacific, they've tried doing this before when they had limits on the amount of money you could take as a pension. It lasted 4 years and was revoked in 2006. We are starting to hear stories now, whether they're right or wrong, but in the back political channels, that there's more conversations about family trusts, and there's certainly conversations around the transfer of family homes on the passing of parents, where it is perceived that people have windfall gains by inheriting their family home as a non-tax dependent, tax-free. Now, from watching what is going on, it's my belief that we're seeing a fundamental change in tax policy rather than a fundamental change in superannuation. And as a lobby group, I am far more fearful of what they are planning to do to family trusts than they are on super funds.
So with that in mind, thank you, John, it sort of gives us the next question is, what's actually proposed here? What are we talking about, and how is it being justified as a reason to go forward?
The tax policy behind what their approach is, that they're objecting. Now, they is the people who draft legislation in Treasury, driven by the relevant minister, is that members of self-managed super funds are enjoying accelerated tax benefits by earning income off large amounts of asset bases in super funds that other people can't accommodate. So it means that they are getting a bigger share of the tax concessions than they should be.
What we're talking about here is a sort of a different way of managing assets, which is quite commonly done. It's just unfortunate in terms of what we're dealing with farmers, because a lot of their assets are these large amounts of land. Katie, when we're talking about how this would go forward and how the current system treats these balances, what's going to change for people? What do we need to be aware of here?
Yeah, so essentially what this tax is doing is that they're trying, as John's absolutely right, they're trying to bring in a tax where they're saying, look, if you have over what we think is more than enough assets inside of superannuation, your tax concessions are greater than everyone else's. So you should pay an additional tax. However, the way that they've gone about implementing this is really the problem, which is where they've come up with this new definition of earnings. So they've said, look, the industry and retail funds, this is how they calculate earnings, where they basically say, what's your closing member balance minus your opening member balance, add back, withdrawals and take off contributions, and that's how much you've made this year. Now, obviously, that means it does include movements in asset values rather than actual income. And so that's what this tax is doing, is it's basically saying, well, rather than just taxing the income of the superannuation account at an additional 15%, they are saying we're coming up with this new definition, this new calculation, because we want it to be simple. And that's actually the quote from Treasury was, well, it's simplicity, not equity. And so they've gone with this methodology where they say, well, if your assets, if your member account has changed by this amount, then that is what we're taxing you on at an additional 15% as a proportion over your whole balance. So, and that's really where we're seeing it's unfair. And it does seem to target SMSFs more, because SMSFs can actually tell you exactly how much income they have made per member, whereas retail and industry funds can't.
And Barry, from a farmer's point of view, that brings back to the point you made at the beginning, where there are farmers who are having potentially particularly tough seasons at the moment that are facing having to pay tax on something that they're not necessarily earning an income off of at the moment. As a farmer yourself, how does that feel to know that that's potentially looming at your end?
Well, I think firstly, I'd go back a step. When we were given advice and managed our tax, and we've gone down this track, the rules are on the table. So we make a decision on the day for the rules of the day, and happy to abide by the rules for the time in that contract. So that's the first thing I want to make. The second comment on your question, when we're and I don't want to harp on about this, because I actually want to get behind and support farmers who are finding things a bit tight at the moment in these seasonal issues, conditions, is that this is just more stress on them at a time when it's not needed. And if you might find that with the price of land now, and of course we're talking about an asset that seems to be on paper is growing, and sure, if you sell out, you get the money, but we're intergenerational. That's what we're all about. I'm getting excited saying intergenerational with the thought that my son is going to be growing a canola crop better than mine. I doubt it'll happen, but you never know. So that's where we're going forward with this. And then going through a tough season, I can't sell the back paddock. And if I have just expanded and then I had a bad season, there's more pressure on me. And it's how we deal with this going forward. So that's my concern, and that's what we've got to deal with. And we need to, I'll say it again, unrealised capital gains. We haven't realised the asset, and I could keep going. There's no CPI connected to the 3 mil. I mean, if when we went into this, say I put a farm in it today or some land in it tomorrow, and at that value, and we know what the value is, that's fine. We all know the rules. everything does keep moving along, there's going to be more people fall over the threshold into this scenario every day of the week going forward, because they don't make any more land. And we all know that across Australia and across the world, land in Australia is well priced, is cheap. So it seems to be a one-way type tax.
Barry, what's going to happen is the people who set up these SMS are the people who are the best advised and the most equipped to make those cutting-edge decisions. And when you look at the demographics of self-managed super funds, a lot of funds only have $800 to $1 million in them. There's another elite group that has over 3 mil. Now, that group can be divided into two. The ones that are going to satisfy conditional release now or very soon, and the ones that can't. Now, the ones that satisfy a conditional release now or very soon, they'll simply pull those assets out of superannuation and they'll transfer into other entities. Now, what government has forgotten is if those assets had stayed in super, when those members died and if it did nothing, there was a whole raft of tax that needs to get paid on those death benefits. So in effect, what's going to happen is we're now going to develop a whole new raft of strategies that live within the $3 million cap. Now, we've always been, and there's a certain group of Australians who always will be, at the edge, because changing the rules doesn't mean that it's the end of the story. It just means another chapter in the way we deal with the regulator. Now, unfortunately, that just means cost and complexity. Now, this is a fairly innate effort in trying to bring simplicity in, because when I go and value a farm at East Killarney in a dry year, what number do you think I'm going to get? It can be any number you choose, depending on who's buying and who's selling, and the compliance costs of this will be prohibitive. Now, of course, like all legislation, they've drafted it, they've modelled it against industry funds, as Katie pointed out, and they've got simply no idea of the practicalities of how this is going to work.
Katie, at your end, you've been talking about this quite a lot and have been running sessions like these. What's the first thing that you're telling to people when you're answering the questions? What's the biggest concern?
Well, the first one is the first thing I always say is don't panic, because there is absolutely different strategies that need to come into play here and different decisions that need to be made. Because, you know, as John said, if you're at a condition of release, great, that might mean you're able to access and, you know, transfer the asset out of super, but what capital gains tax implications are there? What's the long-term plan? If you're lucky enough to be in WA, our stamp duty laws are pretty great when we're transferring assets. It's not the same in other states. So, you know, what is the cost that you're going to be looking at to move this? What's the timing that you should start to make these decisions? You know, is this, as Barry said, if this is an intergenerational asset, that's, you know, we don't want those assets in super. But if this is a long-term sale asset, do we want it in super? You know, what impact is this going to have on your small business CGT? I mean, there's so many different factors that come into play with this, that it really does come down to when is the right time to make the decision, and what are all of the things that you need to consider before you do it. And if you're not lucky enough to be able to get the asset out, you know, I've spoken to people you know, who have actually just made the call and said, this land is going to continue to grow and I'm not going to have 150 grand to be able to pay that. You know, I'm better off just trying to get this asset out now, pay the cost, get it out now, because I genuinely think it's going to go up at some point in future. So, you know, it's not an easy decision to make as to what is the right answer, because there's a lot of things that do come into play when you're trying to look at what is right, and every person needs to think about their own circumstances.
So, John, can you talk us through how it actually works when you've got these assets in your super and there's going to be a tax applied to them? How does it actually play out for people?
So the first thing is you obviously need a $3 million total superannuation balance. Now, there is obviously strategies around managing that, and they're going to be far more interesting going forward. And let's assume that you had a $6 million balance. 6 million divided by 3 million is 50%. So the special tax is applied to the earnings, which includes unrealised capital gains, which is the value on anything above $3 million, because the 50% relates to the 3 million divided by the 6 million. So it's not actually on the quantum of the unrealised capital gain, it's on the increment and the proportion above the 3 million, which is, the media haven't done a particularly good job of explaining that.
And I've just seen a question here in the chat from Russell Ipling. He's asked, when does the actual value of the asset get taken? Does it happen from the end of this financial year, start of the new financial year? Or is it backdated to the time of purchase of that land? Is there an indication of how that's
the way that you simplistically approach it, it's at the 30th of June every year, you've got to come up with a value. Now, does that mean someone from a valuers need to go out to Barry Large's farm, cast his eye across the kingdom and say, Barry, your farm is X? Is it every year, or is it every 3 years, or where do we go from here? Now, they have progressively tightened up the valuation rules, but this is going to potentially lower a whole new level of cost in that we've never seen before. Now, these valuers, they're a bit like liquidators. They can be challenging to deal with. And what number are they going to ask for a valuation?
So, Katie, this is, I guess, adding to the admin in terms of running a farm and making decisions. I mean, every good farmer is likely got a business advisor or an accountant working behind the scenes with them on this. They're going to need to go back and have a look, obviously, if it applies to them in terms of the $3 million limit. How are we sort of dealing with the fact that people are going to have to probably restructure a lot of their business behind the scenes here? Is this, I guess, a part of doing business and good business, or is this going to be one of those unnecessary wastes of times that people will perceive it to be like that? To put it bluntly, really.
Yeah, look, no, part of it is definitely a waste of time. Is there does anyone get value out of having to go and pay a valuer to value their asset every single year? Of course not. That's not anything that's really adding value to an intergenerational asset. You're doing it because of compliance, and you're doing it because people are making you to do it. So, that's going to add a layer onto it. I think it's probably going to bring forward some succession transfer, decisions. Are we going to have to start bringing assets out of super earlier? I think John was absolutely right when he talked about, the death benefit tax. I actually think all we're doing is just bringing forward transfers of assets. We're not waiting, until people are getting older. We're going to be doing that now. And I don't think the government's really factored that into their modelling when they've said, this is how much revenue we're going to generate. People are going to restructure, to do that. And the government is then not going to have that death benefit tax at the end. So I think, is this going to add value? No, there's no value that's added to any of this, at all. I think probably, as Russell has asked, look, the key date, there's probably two key dates to think about. One is 1 July 2025, because that's kind of our starting balance. So when they say, what movement in asset value have you had, we start on 1 July 25. But then 30 June 26, which is the first year when we're testing, that closing balance, that's going to be the really key date. And I think there's going to be a lot of activity in this next 12 months for people who are going to be impacted to see, what is that number actually going to look like? And do I need to pull some triggers earlier to restructure? Because that number is going to be big, and I don't want to have to deal with it.
So if you've got a modest amount, let's say you've got $4 million and it's a farm, some of these clients will go, well, we'll just sell 3 of those blocks out, and we'll just simply put cash back in the fund. And therefore, there's no future growth. We've got the land back. It's cost us WA stamp duties about 5.5 down to 5.2, depending on a good day. That's a lot less than what we're going to pay. We'll stay below $3 million and happy days from here. And we'll still pay our rents in. We'll take 100% of the cash out of the fund, and we'll loan it back to our companies and trust under security. While Treasury think they're on a win-up, they have done a very, very poor job of understanding the dynamics around the people who control self-managed super funds.
John, one of the things that you had a pre-chat with me about was talking about other examples around the world of ways to help the system in for what the government is trying to deal with, but without necessarily causing this angst and issue for people to manage their super funds. Can you run us through some of those other concepts that are done around the world?
So, I might be completely wrong thinking that Tony Burke and Tanya Plevisic are on some crusade to equalise incomes in Australia. I apologise if I'm incorrect, but I probably think there's other people in the room who may agree. Rather than a grower group complaining about a $3 million super balance, which the vast majority of people are going to go, oh, it's $3 million, it's more than I've got. The alternative is to say, well, before you destroy this system, can we actually improve it? And like in the US, there is mutual funds which people can invest in, which are tax preferred or tax deferred, meaning that you can put it into an investment that builds a road or a port or a wind farm, and you get capital gains tax-free or income, concessionally taxed income. So rather than destroy what we've already got, are we better going back to government and saying, have you thought about a better way of doing this? If we can develop another investment product that runs alongside superannuation, where everybody who's got cash can invest in, and it's a lot simpler and it's a lot cheaper to run, and we can build grain export facilities and highways and dams. It's the same thing that happened in the US after the Second World War. Now, it's not overly complex to run. It can be distributed through the normal channels. That's a positive thing to say. The other thing we can say to government is that every time someone dies and you're not a death dependent, all this superannuation asset floods back into the economy, and in the vast majorities outside of the farming world, it gets consumed in new cars and holidays, which is not really helping, because those same people, when they retire, are back on an age pension. So are we better off rejigging the whole system to encourage investment in Australian infrastructure? And people seem to be reluctant to have that conversation about why aren't we investing in ourselves, as opposed to an industry fund having a lot of their assets offshore, where on the other side, self-managed super funds, the vast majority are invested in Australia. So those who are investing in Australia are effectively being penalised.
So, Katie, I guess for a lot of people, it's quite concerning when we start to have things changing to our super funds. I mean, for a lot of us, it hasn't really happened in our lifetime in certain ways when it's been our main problem that we've been dealing with. Is super still the best option when we're talking about over $3 million in our super and assets involved? Is that the best way forward?
If you just put the $3 million aside and just ignore it,
yep,
superannuation still has huge benefits for the vast majority of Australians. And rather than just from a farming perspective, look at it from a holistic social and economic benefit of the country. It provides retirement income. Secondly, especially for business people, including farmers, it's a high degree of asset protection. So if a business goes through liquidation or administration, those assets held by those directors that would be caught up under director penalties and other liabilities are protected. Now, the vast majority of our business clients have significant assets in their super fund simply for asset protection. So the asset protection aspect is critical. The second point is that if you've got farmland, especially farmland in superannuation, it allows for mum and dad, when they want to retire, to actually get an income stream from the farm, because the farm's obviously paying rent to the super fund. Mum and dad take that income out as a tax-free pension. It facilitates the liquidity of the movement of farmland. So parents have got some comfort in that they've got an asset that can't be lost, and they've got an income which is assured, and they don't pay tax on it. Now, if they don't pay tax on it, it means that they need less cash to live on, because the tax doesn't become part of their expenditure. So there's a lot more to this story than just the $3 million. It's actually improving the transferability of land. We talk about productivity because we get younger people quicker onto farms. And that's why we've always put assets into super funds, is to be a quasi asset protection, family succession strategy. And it has worked extremely well. The thing that's probably caught us out is none of us ever expected land to go up as much as it has. And the second thing, we didn't think the Labor government would try to sneak in this sort of tax policies that we only know in Finland and Norway, which are completely socialistic systems.
Katie, you said to me earlier tonight that this has been around for a fair while and it's almost caught the industry off guard in a certain extent, and now it's going through quite quickly. And I can see a story here in the question here in the Q&A from Ronald Story, and he's making the same comment that it's a minute to midnight, Parliament meets in July, what practical steps can we propose here? It really is something that has been lying dormant for a long time and now is being pushed through.
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, you know, this was announced a long time ago. You know, it went through the House of Reps. It got referred, you know, to a Senate committee who came back and said, no problems, we think it's fine. It stalled in the Senate. They couldn't get the support. And the election result genuinely, I think, caught everyone off guard. You know, I was at the SMSF conference in February where everyone was it was like a party had happened because everyone was celebrating, saying, we've defeated this tax. This tax is not going to get through. And then we got the election result, which we did, which, you know, it sort of it caught everyone off guard, saying we never thought that would happen. We never thought it would be with the level of, you know, power that they've got to be able to pass these kind of policies, which, you know, does make us think, where is it going to go next? And, you know, anyone that has watched Jim Chalmers give an interview over the last month can see he's just getting more and more irritated by people challenging him on this tax. And he is doubling down and is giving no indication that he is interested in making any sort of adjustments to it. You know, he put the entire industry offside. He did actually make a comment where he said, well, you know, industry didn't come to us with any other suggestions on how we could implement this tax. And everyone immediately acted up and said, hang on a minute, mate. We were all in, you know, consultation with you. We were all in the meetings. We gave you all these different options and you rejected all of them and said they weren't on the table. So I think at this point, we really are at the point of it's more about management than really looking at, can we actually make any difference in the next, you know, a couple of months before Parliament sits again, or month and a half.
An interesting question here in the chat, who they've prefaced it by saying it could be a silly question, but it's kind of showing the danger of pushing policy through at the last minute, and there will be questions like this that will pop up down the track as we all adjust. With farms that have renewable projects on them, which may take the asset well and truly over that $3 million mark, is that still going to apply to these farms over the lifetime of the project? Does that somehow, that part of the farm, become exempt because it's a lease entity? How does that affect the situation?
Firstly, this is not a one-off. There is a clear agenda by the current government to change how tax policy affects wealth management and wealth retention in Australia. Now, we can all say this is a one-off. It is not a one-off. They've got a very clear agenda to drive a reallocation of wealth. And from a lobby group's perspective, it is about getting on the front foot now and calling them out about how ineffective this has been, and asking them when they can be honest about what their real agenda is. Because if we don't, there'll be something else in 6 months, then there'll be something else in another 6 months, and it'll be incremental. And given the way that the House is stacked at the moment, you're going to have trouble getting it stopped. So you've got to really put pressure back on those voters who are hardcore Labor voters, who are going to suffer these problems as well in the fullness of time.
I can see Barry very politely raising his hand here.
Yeah, it's very polite for Barry. My question for Katie and John is that you guys have given me a good understanding, a far better understanding than where I am with this. The complexity for me is that with succession planning, tax benefits while we're doing these sort of things. Obviously, the government is trying to drag in a bit more income. There's no doubt about that in my mind. So how do we solve the problem? And we can whinge to the government, but we've got to tell them how we can help them with their dilemma. What would you guys? Where's the happy medium? I guess I'm putting out there, Rachel. Where is that happy medium? Because we know things just keep evolving, and we'll all get good advice, and we'll try and evolve to get around it. So really, nothing is gained here. Just a lot of administrative work, and which just keeps people in jobs, I guess, but leaves less. So I'm trying to be. I'm trying to accept what's going on. I come back to, I'm gibbering here, but I'll come back to the hardest thing is unrealised capital gains going on top of our taxable income annually. And that is our concern, particularly when John's comment about land prices. Who would have thought land would go from $30 an acre to $4,000 an acre in 30 years? And I can demonstrate that.
So Barry, just to
Yep.
answer your question, Barry,
Yep.
what are you going to say as an industry representative when Jim Chalmers comes out in 6 months' time and said, we've had a look at family trusts and they're flow-through entities, meaning they don't pay tax. Any income in a family trust flows to the beneficiaries. This looks very similar to a super fund because they're both trusts. We think now that it is only equitable that any of those assets held in those family trusts need to be valued every year, and you can pay tax on the increment as a proportion of the revenue or proportion of the taxable distribution in a family trust. Now, how do you think you're going to react to that? Now, tonight you're being relatively calm and well-mannered. When they decide to get into your trust, I think your reaction is going to be far different to what I'm seeing tonight.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I'm just trying to, like, how many times do you want us to pay the tax on the money? That's my real question.
That's the I guess the overall issue here is that for farmers, we are dealing with a lot of different taxes affecting us in a lot of different ways. Got a lot of money going out on a lot of expensive assets to be able to grow something that is feeding the world and the country. And then we've had added extra pressure when the rules change. Katie, for people who are sort of navigating this space now and moving into maybe completely restructuring large parts of their farm, I mean, we've had John mention now other parts of the system in terms of trust and how the inheritance looks, and that's a big part of farming in Australia, is making sure that it can be passed down. I mean, my family farm has done just that and exists to do that, and the whole industry relies on farmers being able to do that. How do we deal with this, and what do we need to look at so that we can still protect our assets and ensure that the next generation of farmers have something to farm out there?
I think that's a really interesting discussion point, and I think, you know, if you also look at, you know, comments that Chalmers has been saying over the last month when he's been asked about, well, what is next on the agenda, and he's really careful when he says, you know, we're not looking at this and we're not looking at this, and then you look at, but what does he never talk about? And he's really specific about that. He's never said we're not going to look at trusts, we're not going to look at, you know, capital gains discounts, we're not going to look at these things. And so I think there is a really big risk that this is just, you know, we're looking at restructuring, you know, to avoid this tax. But if we're moving assets out to restructure, to put into trust, which you're absolutely right, is a classic succession vehicle. You know, we want to, you know, we love to put things in trust. That actually may be next on the agenda. You know, and again, you can't future-proof for everything, but I think there'd be a hell of a lot of frustrated people if they look to restructure, if they started that, because succession planning takes a lot of time. This isn't something we do off a whim. You know, this for some people, this is a, you know, 10-year exercise. if you know, we're then looking at another taxing system or another regime or more changes, I think the level of frustration is going to be far greater, because at the moment, the people impacted by this SMSF change is quite small. Those impacted by a family trust, there's going to be a lot more voices in the room that are going to be complaining, and whether or not that does deter them from making those changes, you know, it would be interesting to see.
Because the demographic of the angry people is not going to be the grey-haired fraternity who living on the coast now. It's going to be the newly married young farmer who suddenly realises that the last 20 years that he spent working for nothing, Chalmers is now going to tax him off the face of the earth. Now, if you want to see young farmers get really angry, starting to threaten their equity in the land, and Chalmers won't know what's got hold of him if he goes down this road.
What are we looking at process-wise from here, just so that we can get an understanding of the next steps in terms of this policy and what will happen for people over the next 12 months, just to give people a better understanding of what they need to look at, but also what's coming up in terms of the government processes? Anybody that wants that one?
So, without putting too fine a point on, the quality of the advice that is generally provided to self-managed super funds does have some shortcomings. And what I'd be saying to anybody who's got this problem is you need to go and have conversations with a number of different firms and different people to actually first understand what you're really dealing with, because you've probably never paid any attention to it really before, apart from signing the tax return, and taking a very measured and careful view on how it all works. Now, I hear comments like, oh, we're going to be taxed on the unrealised capital gain. Well, that's from a gross perspective, that's not correct. It's actually only on the increment, which is called income. So before people really get excited, they need to self-educate and understand exactly what they've got. And that might mean going and getting second opinions from different parties who may have a completely different view on life, which is going to be advantageous. Walking into some lawyer's office saying, I want to restructure, here's 100 grand, I would expect is a complete waste of money unless the members of the fund have taken the time to educate themselves. Katie might have a different version.
No, I absolutely agree. I think actually, you know, when we've run this kind of exercise with people, breaking it down, modeling it out and going, this is actually the impact. Let's look at what happened if it was this. Let's look at what happened if it was this. Make it actually a real number, understand how it specifically applies to you, understand the calculation, understand the formula, so that at least any decision you're making is an educated one and it's based on what is right for you, not for, you know, as a panic to, oh no, I don't want to pay this. Hang on a minute. Let's actually see how it applies to you and make the right decision for your structure and your, you know, your succession, your family, all of that needs to come into play. It might be that, you know, super is still the best tax environment to have assets. You know, it just depends on, you know, how much you've got in there and, you know, what your asset mix is. So it's the best thing you can do is really understand how this applies to you specifically and what are actually your long-term goals and how does it fit in.
Barry, for farmers heading into the new financial year now, and I mean, not everybody's going to be affected by this straight away, and it may not affect others at all. From your end and having a look at your own farm business, you're having to take stock now, aren't you?
Look, it's pretty obvious for me what I'm going to do is I am going to take stock. I'm going to seek good advice. And hopefully I've got a good accountant, and I will talk to other people, and I like John's perception of, you know, just get a feel. But I think I say to most farmers, we need to see what our exposure is, seek the advice, and think about it. And as we do every year, we do a bit of tax planning. Well, this is just a deep dive into a bit more planning that we need to do going forward and hedging us. Now, that's fine for me with having had a little bit of rain. I say to the people who are a bit short at the moment and thinking about where they're going and that, it's more imperative for them to go and seek the advice, understand it, and know where they're going, so that they're not thinking things that aren't really right. And I must admit, I've learned a bit more tonight about what it's doing. As they say, the early bird gets the worm. We need to be prepared. We need to unite, and we need to do what we need to do to work through it.
Barry, as a prominent leader in the grains industry, is GPA going to go back and tackle the government on where they set this tax agenda? Because if someone doesn't take them on, they will just have a go. There's no doubt in my mind, and you're going to have to call them out.
Oh no! Look, GPA won't step the hard things. I mean, we stepped in on the biosecurity tax, and we presented a valid argument why this wasn't fit for purpose, and we will go into bat with this in the same agenda, that we will seek the right advice, and we'll look for support from growers, that this is the way forward, and we will make it known that there needs to be a bit more thought put into where we're going with this. And I'm sure that we will tap on the shoulders of a couple of people like you guys for a bit of help to make sure that we get it right. But yeah, no, we will certainly be presenting why this is maybe not quite right for growers.
Is there any other points that you think are important to raise in front of the people here tonight, Katie, that you would like to make people aware of?
Look, I'm always going to say to people that just don't panic. Make sure you understand your circumstance. I can't, keep saying that to people enough, is that, people do get caught up in what is in media. It's so important to understand specifically, how does this apply to you before you make any decisions? Because it can be an expensive decision. It may be better off to, delay the decision slightly so that it's the right decision for the longer term.
And John?
I agree totally. Get a good handle on what your circumstances are, and when you go and get advice from anybody, get it in writing. Don't walk out of the meeting and say you've had a conversation. You need it in writing so you can go home and review it, and you need to go and make sure you've got a plan that solves all of the issues, not just puts a band-aid on this immediate issue, because it's going to bring out a lot of other issues with estate planning and asset protection that the government's unfortunately going to discover that prompting the people with the most money means they'll move the fastest, and the revenue they think they're going to collect, they won't collect it.
I can see a couple of questions popping up there in the chat, and Katie's having a look at one of them now. Katie, are you able to answer that question? Is that something that makes, I'm not the financial expert here, but Adam O'Brien's asked, what would happen if you sold the intergenerational land between generations? Are there tax implications if you sold it for $1 an acre?
Yeah, no, so there are. So everything that you do between related parties for a super fund do need to be on arm's length terms. Now, so everything that you use as a price needs to be able to be substantiated, by a valuation or anything like that. So unfortunately, there's no wiggle room on that. Now, you might have some wiggle room as to what does the valuer say is the value. $1 an acre is probably a hard one to get past at the moment, even in a bad year.
Definitely. Well, without any further questions popping up tonight, and if anyone does have anything, please send it through and we'll do our best to provide some answers over the next few days. But in general, from Katie and John tonight, we can see that it's really going to be next steps for people to go back and seek their own advice relevant to their own situations and make sure that they're across what their goals are and the best way forward for their business. I really want to thank you both, and yourself, Barry, for coming along and joining us tonight. It really is a skill set that you both have that is so important to be able to ask questions when we're dealing with an unknown and quite a big change in a situation like this. We've obviously seen how complex the proposed changes are, and also why it's important that farming families really do take stock and seek informed advice. And look, we've taught Barry something, if nothing else tonight, but I can see comment in here in the chat that there's other value from other participants along as well. Barry, do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
Oh, look, just before we close, I see Matthew's question there, and I was hoping one of you guys might just answer it. Matthew's saying, should we be advocating for farmland to be exempt from this process?
Should we?
Yeah.
Look, I think it's more what would be the likelihood of success. Treasury at this stage and the comments that have come back is, well, super funds, when we've raised the issues of farmland has increased so rapidly, rental yields have not gone up by the same amount, you're creating cash flow problems. The response has been, but funds are supposed to, consider liquidity. Now, we always say, well, great, you can plan for liquidity on a tax you know about, not on a tax that you don't know about and on something that you've not done. So should you be advocating? Absolutely. Is there a likelihood of success? I don't think so. But should you? Is there a downside?
There's no downside. Okay, thanks, Katie. So anyway, just to closing comments from myself is that certainly, John, thank you very much for your time and effort. And Katie, very nice to meet you. And thank you for your time and effort. And look, I just say to everyone who's made an effort to come on tonight, well appreciated. And thank you very much for your time. And look, I keep the conversation going around the community, I would please, and get behind GPA, and we'll try and represent growers through and give the government of the day what our perspective is, and try and have a balanced conversation with them and watch this spot. So once again, thank you. Rachel, be remiss of me not to say well done, well organised, well constructed. Thank you. And that crop's pretty lush behind you. So
look,
is it your lawn? I'm trying to work out. But no, thank you all very much. And I'll catch up with you along the road. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And please stay in touch with GPA and the work that we're doing at grainproducers.com.au. We'll have some information, and the video will be online in the next few days to refer back to. Thanks again.
Thank you.